So I wanted to start this discussion by talking about, we were talking yesterday, and I was like, this building is fantastic. Let's jump into how sustainable design built it. And I had a very nice piece of feedback from Bryan saying, Chris, I'm not sure if it was utilized in the building of this building, which brought me to a moment of ignorance, saying, well, wait a minute, I thought I knew what this is, and maybe I don't. So I want to open up for the group. What is the sustainable design process, and how do we think about it, and why is it important? Please.
Yeah, what I think is very interesting, we talk a lot about ecological sustainability. My focus is on social sustainability. So we look towards the future and see how social structures thrive, and how topics such as mobility, but also employment, or access to education, or access to play for that matter, is intertwined in urban development, and which questions we should ask or don't ask ourselves yet, in order to fully understand how urban development and the choices that we spatially make affect the humans in how they can live their life. Mm-hmm. So,
Bryan?
For me, sustainability is a question of what will be rejected eventually by the climate, by the people, or by the economy. And if we don't understand that, then we can't make good choices now. So we have to understand the feedback loops of natural systems, human systems, and financial systems, so that we can design things that are going to keep going, right? And if we do that, then we're sensitive to human condition, to climate, to other important issues.
And I really like that answer, because I think the best yeses are premised on many, many nos. It's like, how do you sift through all of these inputs and people advocating for their position or their structure, their approach, but getting to the one that serves the best? Ian?
Historically, there's been a tendency for sustainability or sustainable design to have a degree of tunnel vision. And I think that now the sustainable design process needs to really foreground this notion of systems, so that we take into account the complexity of where our interventions are impacting other things along the line. So it's very much a systems design methodology.
So I want to play with that idea of silos versus systems, and the idea of how do you actually bring communities involved or different stakeholders involved in design. So why does this need to be an interdisciplinary activity? Why do you need to bring these stakeholders along rather than just driving ahead on, Siobhan, your great idea?
Yeah. So for your idea, I work with in a company where approximately 2,500 people, from urban development to actual construction work. And out of those 2,500 people, there's probably 2,300 people that are actually working in the urban or the spatial realm. And so I have discussions with my colleagues, ethical discussions, but also very practical discussions about, for example, why children are not playing outside. And one of the biggest reasons one of the big reasons in the Netherlands, besides technology and gaming and television, is because of people are just not taking care of dog poop. And so I asked my colleague...
We're talking about real problems here, people.
Yeah, but it's true. Like, this is actually preventing children to play outside and to learn how to fall in a safe environment or whatever. And so I asked one of my colleagues, I said, did you ever design a space where people can actually take their dogs? So that this is... And he said, no, I've never actually thought of that. But it's been annoying me for 20 years. So somehow when people get into the office and put on their urban designer suit or whatever, they forget that they're actually people and that they're facing these real life problems as well. So it's like we're talking about things on a very big, intangible scale, but it's also about the very small things that we just forget to address when we're not thinking about things from an interdisciplinary perspective.
See, I love panels like this. I was not expecting that answer. From your guys' perspective, when you think about the stakeholders, people you brought in, people that you need to have at the table, who are they? Who are voices that sometimes aren't there that need to be in your experience?
Naturally, the climate crisis is explained by scientists. We often see it through a very scientific lens. So we sometimes see it as a scientific crisis. And I think that if we start to see or as we should do, the climate crisis as a cultural crisis, it's very much, our material culture is very much a part of that, then I think you can see that how many more of our stakeholders should be brought into this, because it's a cultural crisis, a social crisis, a political crisis, an economical crisis. So this notion that I've had these very frustrating conversations with scientists in the past where perhaps as a designer, I've not done a very good job of explaining what we do. And I say to the scientist, we should collaborate. And the scientist looks at me and says, well, I can't think what you could possibly design for me, as if he's expecting me to design him a chair made out of old bottles. That's not what we do. We actually we're able to bring a particular way of thinking through problems and visualizing our problems. And it's not just for designers to solve either. It's for everybody to be part of this conversation, because it goes back to the systems. Everybody is part of that system, and there are stakeholders everywhere in that approach. So this notion of design being at a hub, or this idea of being T-shaped and having a greater understanding of what each other does, I think will help us move forward. But it's certainly not that the siloing is really, really unhelpful.
Brian?
I want to actually advocate for silos for a minute.
We're gonna go there next, but do it now.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about why we have silos now, it's because we have billions of people on a planet with lots of really diverse needs, and there's a lot of work to do to keep them fed and sheltered and everything else. So we have to find some way to divide and conquer. We have to find some way to work together. And silos were an answer to that at some point in time, right? So it's not necessarily a bad idea, but I think the friction that we experience in a moment like this is actually because the silos that we have, or the way of organizing collective effort that was invented by our grandparents, is not matching the world that we experience. And so that friction is the thing that, in my opinion, needs to be rethought. And so in conversations about systems, I do a lot of innovation workshops, getting people around a really hard problem, thinking around how do we address this issue? How do we solve this sustainability of the built environment, or whatever it is? And one of the things that always comes up is, what if we had a ministry of, or a government department of, or a deputy mayor of? That's just another silo, right? So we need to find new ways to work together, and new ways to bring in voices that have been traditionally excluded by expertise. But that also has to happen at scale. So I think that's the tension that we need to find, is how do we do things really big, but still make room for very wide constituencies.
And sometimes when you're bringing in those czars, or those groups, or those studies, you're actually creating bottlenecks. You're doing the opposite of what you're trying to do. So I'm a huge proponent of systems, as all of you as well, but I also believe there is true human genius. And so when you look at the history of architecture, the history of city design, there's been moments in time in which you've actually had remarkable build as a result of individuals who have pursued a certain focus or belief, which wasn't a stakeholder systems approach. It was very much the opposite. And what I see in technology development is I find founders who are unbelievable creatives and unbelievable technologists and engineers, but who have never tested their product on real people. And so when you think about the balance between R&D and stakeholder engagement and human genius of design, where people truly do have a better idea, how do you balance that?
Well, actually, I was having a very interesting conversation on systems, heating systems, for example. In housing, we do a lot of renovation projects. I think it's already been addressed earlier. We're also working on the energy transition. And so in every renovation project that we do, we also think of giving them better energy access. And so what happens, especially in social housing, is that we're trying to get the best system in the house as possible, because that has been proven to be the most efficient or energy neutral system. But then when people are actually using the system, the complexity of the use is so high that people are not using it the way it's designed. So in the long run, it would have been probably better to choose a less complex and also maybe less sustainable option. But when you calculate the usage of the system in the long run, that is going to be the more sustainable option. Mm-hmm. And so I think that is exactly the thing, that when you design something with the best intentions, that in the long run, the way it's used is not necessarily the best option.
And I want to come back to this idea of intentionality around design to have the biggest impact, which may seem backwards to someone who's just looking for a binary switch from petro to energy or battery, for example. But any other comments on that first question?
I just want to add that you used an analogy of digital products.
Sure.
And we're sitting in a physical product, a building. This building, like 99.9999999% of all other buildings, is a prototype. Nobody's ever built this before. We also know way less about what this building is doing than anybody here with a smartwatch knows about your body right now. So you might have a Nest thermostat at home. This building might have a building automation system. But in general, the built environment is just devoid of data. And it's one of, frankly, the last places in our life that doesn't have a whole host of data attached to it that's accessible for decision-making and for tweaking and iteration. So I think one of the questions here is also, how do we give ourselves the information to collectively make decisions? And right now, there's a lot of opacity, there's a lot of invisibility around things that are really essential to us and often our biggest investment, like a building.
Just a comment on the building. To quote an old friend of mine, Ed Hollis, many buildings seldom end up being used for their original intention. So in Detroit, we see it. I work in a building that used to be something else. This building used to be something else. The station across the road used to be something else. So I think the buildings need to be designed in this kind of sense of, how it's like the way that we design products for disassembly. Do we need to design buildings in the same way, or do we need to design buildings for adaptability so that they can always transform their use when their use is no longer needed?
Please.
Yep. And I also think that it's good because you're talking about intention, but I think we can actually use data to formulate a good strategy on this intention. And what's happening now a lot in the Netherlands is that this data is mostly available on the technical specs of the environment, but also KPIs on numbers of housing or numbers, and we're not taking into account, for example, unemployment rates in specific neighborhoods to really think about what type of neighborhood we're going to make from a social perspective, or the distance for people to actually get to their work and how that relates to our mobility ambition. So I do think that we can really use this data in the broad sense to actually think of which strategy we should apply in redeveloping existing neighborhoods or developing new neighborhoods. But this is also the systemic approach that we're still trying to invent with each other, how we can use all this information.
And distilling down all three of your comments, I'm seeing this theme around, and there needs to be an intentionality of approach. And so we have a thesis that we put forward, something in terms of what's the right systemic approach to looking at global mobility. We call it ISA. It's infrastructure, systems, applications. Infrastructure, physical and digital, the systems layer that connects the bytes and the atoms, and being intentional about the fact that there maybe software is eating the world, but there still is a world that we have to engage with. And the applications in terms of how we engage consumers or customers or partners or citizens. What is the technology that you're most excited about today when it comes to that intentionality of approach? What are things we should be doing better in every new build right now from either a design or an application perspective? Just looking at technology we have that maybe isn't being used, or things that you would like to see that frankly should be there, but they're just not out there today.
Well, for me, I would like to have this framework where we can have access all these different types of data on different skills, so we can actually make this to see the connection. And also, you're talking about technology for mobility, but I used to look at, for example, performances of high schools in neighborhoods in relation to our mobility goals in newly to build neighborhoods.
Neighborhoods in Amsterdam or in the Netherlands.
In the Netherlands. And so what happens if we start to make a new mixture of people in neighborhoods, and we, for example, add economically, how do you say that, more successful, whatever, higher economic range, whatever. What we see is that instead of bringing their children to an existing badly performing school in the neighborhood, they decide to get into the car and drive to a village elsewhere to give their child proper education. So this entire mobility change is, for me, directly tied to educational performance, for example. So this, for me, the wish for technology is not necessarily to design new products or use this technology in products, but to give us actually more insights in how all these things are connected.
So that's interesting in terms of taking data sets and utilizing physical assets or going to different places based on the data. So it's being presented to the human, presented to the individual, which will dictate their movement.
Our capacity to organize and process data is exponentially growing, and now we live in this world of AI. People aren't talking about AI very much, but it can think much faster than humans. But I think that I'm not entirely sure how that's going to help how that's going to be implemented in building design. But one thing I do know is that buildings are very, very energy intensive, both in their construction and then their use afterwards. So I think that kind of energy assessment is really important. So if we're looking at materials that I'm the most technologies that I'm the most excited about, it's materials. It's the new materials that we can bring into the construction, so that we can look at that reduction of energy. But then afterwards, some way of optimizing that building's use. But somebody said something, I think it was Matt Stout said on the panel earlier, the most sustainable thing you can do in construction is not build it. So figure out, do we actually need it before we build it? Some buildings undoubtedly are vanity projects. So,
just as a quick aside on that comment, I was just at MIT last week, and I have somewhat of a nemesis that I find myself on stage with from time to time. And he hates automobiles, and he hates everything except public transit. And I love public transit, but I also love empowering humanity. And so we had this little back and forth, and his answer is always, just don't buy it, don't build it, don't do it. And I think it's a fascinating approach because I think we have to be focused on transition. And to your point, like, how do we use these things to transition to completely clean energy, but still be honest about the needs of humanity? So.
If we're going to talk about transit, I've got an answer to that. When I moved to the United States 4 years ago, and I'm in my mid-50s now, and I bought my first ever car 2 years ago. First ever car, and it feels like a step backwards, although I have to admit that cars are incredibly useful. I can't believe how useful this thing is, but equally, before that, I cycled or took public transport or used a zip car. So, but I also lived in cities that had that infrastructure. I lived in Edinburgh before that, and then London. But don't buy the car. But I'm living in a city where it's almost impossible to live without a car. Almost impossible. And that comes back to that kind of infrastructure that we need to be thinking about. Perhaps I should own a car, but perhaps I need to find ways to use it a lot less than I currently do, or a way to share it a lot more than I currently do.
So.
Ian, you're sounding kind of American. What I hear is that you want choice. Because that's the thing, right? In America, we've built cities so that you do not have a choice. You must have a car in the vast majority of American cities.
Of course.
It's actually one of the most anti-American things, if you think about it. But that's the reality that we're in now.
I'm very familiar with the New York World Fair of 1939, Norman Bell Geddes' vision of the future of cities connected by cars. And that was pretty much what was prescribed for us here.
Yeah, and it's interesting because in the Netherlands we actually are doing the complete opposite, where some of the new neighborhoods that we're currently developing are not accessible by car. And that also comes with a wide range of completely different problems because, for example, our healthcare system is invented in a way that we stimulate people to live at home as long as possible, which also means that we have a lot of care at home, and these people are efficiency driven. So if they can't access their patients by car, it's decreasing their effectivity. So also this system of healthcare is directly connected by this accessibility by car or not. So also doing the complete opposite also brings completely different challenges.
Totally agree. And to your point around inputs into construction and differentiated ways around robotic construction that we're seeing now, huge carbon mitigation, much more efficient processes, looking at the beginning of data utilization in home build. Are there any technologies that you're specifically focused on when it comes to sustainability and urban design?
Educating a generation of people who think that the way that we think about cities should be digital from the start, right? So to your point, we move things by car because that's been the easiest thing to do. But telemedicine is one of the things that's going to obviate the need for moving people by cars, not in all cases, but in some. So lots of things that we've answered by physically moving around the city or physically creating buildings can be answered by reconfiguring the existing resources, the existing know-how of the city. And that's a really hard thing to do. And so that's what our degree program at the university is educating students to think about.
I'm not sure if this has been done yet, but are there any questions in the audience? Has this been done, audience? Have we been taking questions all day? Excellent. Any questions? Are there any microphones? I'll bring one to you.
Hi. I'm in residential real estate, and so there is an affordability crisis that's been pretty well publicized, where the affordability index is the lowest it has been in 30 years. So related to some of your other questions, are there technologies, materials, processes that you're excited about for bringing down the cost of creating new housing?
I can just make a shout out for Citizen Robotics here in Detroit, who came up with Michigan's first 3D printed house. It's in Townsend over in Island View. You can go and take a look at it. And I think that sort of the ability to prefabricate housing means that you can reduce the cost. And I think that presents a very exciting thing for us. Also speeds things up, so that time is a big part of the cost with this. So 3D printing is not going to be the panacea for all our problems, but it's certainly something that we can utilize a lot more.
Yeah, we also work on a lot of conceptualized homes, and it's interesting that the core of the things that we create is similar. So it's also we can use the same system, the same modularity to build a lot of homes in a very efficient manner, and so that gives us room to invest elsewhere. And so that comes to more sustainable decisions, but also different types of isolation of the house, for example. So it's not my expertise, but I know that some of my colleagues are very far in developing this type of technology-driven conceptual houses.
What I just add to it is that I see the housing supply chain as the issue itself. So we've taken an idea of building a unit of housing, and there's a role for an architect, an engineer, contractors, a whole array, right? And we parcel them out into people that have to all have their margin, all do their work. And that creates at each juncture an opportunity for that system to not only lose some efficiency, but also lose the ability to learn and improve over time. And so the messiness of the process is itself one of the cost functions. But the other is just pre-approve certain types of housing construction and let it bloom. This is what's happening in places like Los Angeles, for instance, that is pre-approved ADU units. You don't have to apply for a permit. If you build the thing that has already been approved, you're good to go.
Any other questions top of mind?
Hello, my name is Victoria Bell, and I'm here at Newlab Detroit. I'm an educator and technologist. So my question is for Berger. Could you talk a little bit more about the social spatial challenge?
Yeah, so when it comes to terms of KPIs, I think a lot of my challenges are there. So when we have a technical sustainability, for example, from the types of houses that we make, we can quantify it very specifically. Whilst the social impact of the things we do is usually on the long run. So it's harder to quantify, but also harder to commercialize. So if we design a good neighborhood, the benefits are, for example, in employment or education for future generations, or the lowering cost of healthcare because people are living in a healthy environment. And so to quantify these benefits of having good neighborhood design in the long run, it also really requires different types of collaboration to give insights in all these benefits. And so I think one of my challenges right now at this moment is to actually find the right partners to have this discussion. And to also, I think it's been said on one of the panels earlier that you need to be able to budget it up front. And now it is still the responsibility of the developer or the municipality, whilst the benefits are the financial benefits are somewhere else. So it really requires a different type of conversation. I'm not really sure if that answers your question, but this is my biggest challenge right now.
Any additional thoughts, guys, on that question? So one question I'm curious about, when you look across geographies, if you look at new builds and thoughtful stakeholder engagement for cities, whether it be downtowns or extensions of, and you juxtapose that to Dubai, and you think about a lack of sustainable design in almost every way, what are the lessons learned across geographies? Are there things being done here in North America that are we should be proliferating around the world, in Europe that we should be proliferating around the world? They're not here, but are there any things that are unique that you'd like to see as the standard bearers or the standards in general when it comes to design that just aren't being implemented for whatever reason?
I think in America, we have addiction to engagement. I think that engagement is a crutch. I think that we know that we want people to be happy when things are done. And we've convinced ourselves that the way to do that is to do all the work and then say, what do you think? And I think that's frankly BS. I spent part of my career in the Nordic region in Helsinki, Finland. And that part of the world thinks about co-creation, about designing stuff together from the beginning. Experts and citizens. Architects, and which are also experts in their daily life. So I think we have to get out of this loop of like, if we just ask for permission, it's going to be okay. Like, it's not. It's going to be like slightly less bad than it was otherwise. Yeah. So we can be radically more ambitious about how we think about how we go through the motions of creating stuff together, and that would change a lot here in America.
I couldn't agree more. I think co-design is very much part of systems design. Yeah.
We haven't figured this out yet either. So not just in America, I think also big parts of Europe.
But there's a lot of work in the Netherlands around co-design practices, more so than here.
Yeah, but it happens a lot in the planning process. And then when we're actually in the construction process, it's always this, we have to make the budget. And eventually the budget is connected to our KPIs, which once again are mostly the technical or spatial KPIs. So also here we can engage the community in the planning process, but then we end up building something else and say, yeah, hey, sorry, we couldn't afford it. So there's still a lot to go from there.
Can I ask a question?
Oh, please.
Do you have KPIs for a good dinner?
Probably if we sit down for a very designy brainstorm, we can figure some out.
It's hard, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard, but still, I think we can definitely make KPIs for a socially good neighborhood. And it's the problem is that the thing that will work in one area is not necessarily a thing that will work somewhere else. So there's always this need for tailoring and, again, community engagement in trying to figure out what should be our shared ambition for a space. But now, we're not quantifying it at all. So, yeah.
I think a KPI for a good dinner is good company. So you have that excellent conversation. You mentioned the planning process, and I can only really speak from a UK perspective, but sometimes the planning process is controlled by city councillors who are often people that are elected there and people that have absolutely no understanding of the sort of design and planning.
Tell us how you really think, Ian.
And well, they don't. But I mean, so sometimes you want to put forward things that are very innovative and exciting, and they just take the King Charles point of view of that looks like the carbuncle on the face of an old friend. And I think it almost destroyed the British architectural profession. And I think we've got to educate people to be much more open-minded in our approaches. And it's great to have so many Dutch designers here. I'm a great admirer of Dutch design and Dutch architecture. But we need to be way more open-minded about how we approach these things. But community engagement or co-creation is super important with this. We can't be people that impose our ideas on people. That's where Le Corbusier really, really messed up. The architects of that ilk really sort of impose their ideas on people. It's got to be, cities are for everybody, and I think everybody has to be involved in that planning process. But I just contradicted myself. But people need to be educated too.
Yeah, and what I think is also interesting, because what you're saying is that you have decision makers, political decision makers. And so we're actually working on new legislation in the Netherlands that will force municipalities, but also developers to participate with communities in the planning process. And what happens now is that instead of actually doing the works in the communities, there's this wild growth of consultancy agencies that are specialized in engaging communities, and they charge the big bucks. And then what happens is that all these the economic impact of actually reaching out to communities is not necessarily going to the communities, but it's going to the consultancy agencies that are telling us how to engage with communities. So there's this. We create a new minister or whatever. That is happening because we have no clue how to actually engage communities.
More questions from the audience, sir.
Siobhan, I was just.
You can hold it a little closer.
Siobhan, this is a question for you. You were saying that using some of the technologies in your design phase, the sustainability advantages drop off because the users don't use it as intended, right? So what we have done is we have faced the similar problems, but instead of giving up on the technology and going backwards, and we have tried to push the training of the technology for the end user and trying to push them to use the way it's intended to be used. So one feedback on that. But among this discussion, each of you seem to have a different definition of sustainability. And I look at it as, I don't know, somewhere we need to define for each system, subsystem, you need to define the scope of sustainability and then say, does everybody agree or not? So, we can go on forever talking about sustainability unless we figure out what it means to each one of the participants in the system.
Do we need everyone to agree on what it is, or do we have, going back to the KPIs, there's some core attributes that we have to have agreements on when we think about getting sustainable design into every aspect of how we're building?
There's no fixed definition of design, that's for certain. But I do like Herbert Simon's definition of design as being taking an existing situation and transforming it into a preferred one. I think that might be at the root of what we're trying to do with sustainability. But equally, sustainability is an incredibly problematic term, but it's also incredibly complex. So I don't think you can pin it down to just one thing, because it really is something that exists within a constellation of factors that are just up there, that all are interconnected. So I'm not sure that it's necessarily even helpful to pin it down to one thing, because it is an area that requires a pluriversal perspectives, to steal Arturo Escobar's term. There's kind of pluriversality of thinking. We've got to look at it from many different perspectives. So I think that to pin it down to one thing will limit the way that we might respond to it.
Yeah, and for me, it's actually very helpful to have all these different angles to actually have a discussion. And that's on a very wide scope of the idea of urban development, but it can also be very practical, because different definitions of sustainability can be in conflict with each other. And if we see that there's this conflict, we need to be able to actually have a conversation about how we are going to address this conflict, and then which direction is the preferred direction. And a very specific example is we were just discussing the influx of water in our inner cities, and one of the ways to actually cope with that is to have entrances that are a little bit raised. So if there is an influx of water, you don't have wet feet in your apartment. But at the same time, as I was saying, we're also trying to stimulate people to live at their homes longer, and so become older in their homes. So also accessibility in your home when you're getting older is a very big challenge. And so if you have a step to actually access your apartment, you cannot go in with a wheelchair or whatever. So there's this, on this very specific small level, there's this conflict of the different types of sustainability already. And so, but instead of doing one or the other, we could also have the discussion of maybe designing our porches differently to actually address both types of sustainability in an equal way. And so that for me, it's all these different ideas of sustainability are actually helping us to address the real problem in a sustainable manner.
So I love that idea around how do we think about something like porch design as it relates to those that are mobility disabled and require wheelchairs or other things. And for me, and Ian and I were talking about this earlier, I believe everything we do from a business perspective in our life should be in the pursuit of advancing human dignity. And that's nested in that comment. And Ian, you made the comment earlier, you have a lot to say about that. So I'm curious, with the 3 minutes we have left so we can solve this problem, I believe that design is something that has the power to empower individuals in how they move and how the world moves around them. How do you guys think about that in your own personal pursuits or in the organizations you guys have, which are fantastic to lead and influence?
I think that design has the power to, because of the way that designers work in a visual sense, I think design has the power to make complex ideas more visible and sort of move our sort of problem solving forward. I mean, it's not just that, but also I think design can nudge and change narratives. But also one of the key things about design is empathy. I can start listing all the great things about design. I can't really sum it up in one word, to be honest. But I think, visualizing complexity and pushing the narrative and nudging behavior.
The thing I appreciate about working through a design process is that you can't BS it. So if you have values of everybody can get into their home, and yet you build a step that somebody can't pass, it's very clear that you're not meeting your values. Yeah. And so I think one of the things that is really critical here is to remember that a conversation about design is a conversation about what we value. And that is actually really messy. So, you can have KPIs that give you a compass, but there's no map. And I think that's something that we need to come to terms with. It's hard work, but it's hard because it's important.
And I think that design can do the exact opposite. And because if we don't take into account this diverse type of needs, the intention can be very good, but the outcome can be not so good. And for me, what I'm really trying to achieve within my organization is also representation in this design discussion. And another very, very concrete example is that we have a very big Islamic population in the Netherlands. And what we're now doing is that we're going more towards shared community gardens, not taking into account the impact that it has on women that are wearing a hijab that need to actually get dressed to go outside. And now they have the privilege to just use their own garden and just be at home. So also this cultural representation, economic representation on the design table to actually help us decide which values we should address in the design process are very important. And I don't think we're there yet.
We're trying. So this has been an amazing discussion. I've learned 3 core things. 1, when in the Netherlands, watch where you're stepping, especially on children's playgrounds. 2, the Good Company Sustainable Design KPI dinner. We'll have a raffle later today, so stay advised. And 3, be kind and be empathetic and think about the people we're designing for, because we are all in this global neighborhood. And thank you both so much, or all 3 of you so much. Give me a hand.